Before the Civil War ripped America apart, there were stories written in the mud, in the blood, and in the shadows, stories never printed in textbooks. Some have been buried so deep that only their ghosts remain to whisper them. This is one of those stories, a tale about a man born into chains, rejected not because he was weak, but because he was considered too horrifying to be worth selling. Yet somehow that same man became Louisiana's most feared, most hunted, and most legendary name. Prepare yourself, because this isn't just history, this is horror wrapped in truth. He was born into a world where value was measured in muscle, obedience, and the ability to survive pain without breaking. Yet the moment Moses Walker entered the world, everyone around him decided he would never hold value at all. His first breath was not welcomed with celebration, but with recoiling faces and muttered curses. His skin bore patches of discoloration, his jaw appeared uneven as though nature itself had sculpted him in haste, and his left eye, clouded like a fogged window, gave him a stare no one dared hold for long. From infancy he was labeled wrong, cursed, malformed. On plantations where slaves were sorted like livestock and appraised, the whispers started early that Moses was a child born unwanted by both God and man. His mother, already breaking under the chains of forced labor, barely had strength to raise her head when her child was placed near her. Some said she cried because she loved him. Others said she cried because she knew what a world like theirs would do to a boy like him. Moses grew up without being handled the way other slave children were. Overseers rarely bothered striking him, not because of mercy, but because they detested looking at him long enough to raise a whip. While other children were taught obedience through punishments, Moses learned silence. He wandered the edges of the plantation, lingering near barns and swamps, watching. There was a power in being ignored, a strange kind of freedom in being invisible to the world that wished you did not exist. While other children had routines forced upon them, Moses learned the landscape. He studied the changing shadows of the fields, memorized the paths that overseers used when patrolling, noticed the food storage locations, and watched the way the river carried sounds through the night. If there was one thing he learned before he learned to speak, it was how to survive without ever being seen. By the time he reached 10 years of age, he was taken to the slave market to be evaluated. The auction yard smelled of sweat, fear, and desperation. Men with ledgers examined bodies the way butchers examined cattle, hands probing shoulders, arms, teeth, backs. When Moses was pushed forward, there was a pause. One trader stepped back, another scoffed, and a third shook his head. He was whispered about like a malformed animal that could neither be eaten nor bred. A price was never written beside his name. There was no bidding. Instead, he was left tied to a post in the sun, unclaimed, unpurchased, while the auction continued as though he were a stain that could not be scrubbed out. That day taught Moses a deeper lesson than any enslaved man was meant to know. Worthlessness in the eyes of evil could become its own kind of shield. If the world refused to see him as human, then maybe he could roam through it without being bound. Because he was not bought, no plantation owner ever bothered assigning him a permanent place. He drifted from shack to barn, wherever shadows offered shelter. When he grew old enough to walk the land on his own, he did so without the looming threat of ownership. Slaves belonged to someone, Moses belonged to no one, and that became the first seed of fear others would later have for him. Rumors spread among workers that he was born under a curse. They said no master claimed him because spirits had already done so. He had no whip scars, no overseer commands, no chains around his ankles. He was an outsider even among his own kind, but that isolation crafted him into someone sharper, someone who watched, listened, and waited. And while others were trapped by walls they could not climb, Moses studied how to avoid being trapped altogether. As he grew in height and strength, his body only became more unsettling to those around him. His shoulders widened, his hands grew large like tools shaped by hardship, yet his gaze remained lopsided and eerie. Children on the plantation ran when he appeared, not because he ever harmed them, but because fear is easier to teach than compassion. Adults crossed themselves when he passed as though he were a walking omen, and Moses, instead of shrinking under this fear, absorbed it. He learned that terror could be a weapon. If others already feared him without reason, perhaps that fear could one day keep them from standing too close. He became a ghost in his own lifetime, drifting unnoticed, while the overseers whipped bodies that were trapped in the open. He learned their voices, their schedules, their cruelty. He learned which overseer drank himself into a stupor after sunset, which one snuck away to sleep with slaves in the dark. He knew which patrol routes left gaps large enough for a slipping body to disappear into the swamp, and which barns held keys to chains. Knowledge became the currency he collected, and no one realized he was gathering it because no one paid attention to the boy they wished didn't exist. Other slaves sometimes whispered to him when no one watched, asking how he managed to avoid work, beatings, labor. Moses never answered, not because he could not speak, but because silence was the invisible cloak that kept him untouched. A voice could be recognized, imitated, trapped. Silence could not. As the years passed, his invisibility turned to quiet power. The very thing the world decided made him worthless became the foundation for him to understand freedom long before he ever attempted to take it. He was too ugly to sell, too strange to claim, too feared to approach. No price could be placed on him because no one believed he was worth owning, and in that twisted cruelty lay the beginning of everything he would later become, the seed of transformation that would make him the most dangerous man Louisiana had yet to witness, a man with no chains, no master, and no rules to follow. Louisiana in the mid-1800s was a place where the land itself seemed to breathe with sorrow. The swamps stretched endlessly, their waters thick with secrets and creatures born of darkness. Cypress trees stood tall and crooked like silent witnesses to every crime committed beneath their shade. Plantation houses, white and grand from a distance, concealed horrors within their walls so brutal that even the thickest night air could not silence the cries trapped beneath the floorboards. This was a world where heat and cruelty were partners, where the sun baked blood into dry soil and mosquitoes fed on the suffering of men, women, and children who were forced into labor until their backs split and their hands bled. In these fields and forests, the presence of death was not a stranger, but a familiar guest that returned daily. It was within this setting that Moses Walker drifted like a phantom, invisible yet ever present. Workers believed the land itself rejected him, that the swamps whispered to him because he too was something nature couldn't quite categorize. Louisiana was a place of folklore, where superstition clung to every home, and stories of hauntings were passed down like heirlooms. Slaves spoke in hushed tones of spirits roaming the woods, of lantern lights flickering where no human should be, of a horned demon said to haunt men who committed unforgivable sins. Into this already trembling world, Moses became a figure who fit too comfortably, as though destiny sculpted him for this place of fear. When children saw his silhouette slipping along the tree line at dusk, they believed he was a revenant. When the wind carried a rustle after midnight near the sugarcane fields, some would whisper that Moses was close, and to speak his name was to invite misfortune. The plantation system in Louisiana thrived on terror. Overseers carried whips and guns, but more powerful than either was the fear they instilled. They made examples of the disobedient with public punishments, tying men to posts and lashing until bones became visible. Women were dragged into barns where their screams met only wood and darkness. Yet Moses watched all of this from a distance, never standing among the punished or the punisher. He floated between worlds, never belonging to either, and this gave him a vantage point few possessed. While others suffered visibly, Moses suffered in silence, storing every memory of cruelty deep inside him like tinder waiting for a spark. The land itself played a role in shaping him. Louisiana's swamps were labyrinths where the sunlight barely touched the water. Spanish moss hung like torn cloth from ancient trees, and the air smelled of decay and old spirits. Alligators glided silently beneath the surface, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. These swamps became Moses's refuge. While overseers searched open fields to ensure slaves were at work, Moses slipped into the wetlands where nobody dared follow. There, knee-deep in cold mud, he learned to move without sound. He learned which roots curled like fingers beneath the water, which paths never flooded even when storms raged, and which patches of ground were so soft they swallowed anything placed upon them. The swamp became his accomplice, a living force that hid him when he needed to disappear and swallowed his secrets whole. Rumors grew faster than crops. Some claimed Moses had made a pact with the spirits of the dead, that he spoke to the ghosts of slaves who had drowned trying to escape. Others believed he could control animals because no hound had ever been seen tracking him, and dogs that sniffed his path whimpered instead of barking. His strange appearance only fueled these tales. That clouded, lifeless eye seemed to pierce through lies. His uneven features made him look almost inhuman, and in a world where superstition ruled the night, the line between man and monster was easily blurred. Overseers spat at the mention of him, yet they never attempted to drag him into work. Something held them back, something unspoken yet powerful, something that made hardened men feel a coldness in their spine whenever they considered forcing Moses to obey. While most enslaved men learned strength through endurance, Moses learned strength through observation. He witnessed how fear worked like a weapon in the hands of overseers. He saw how one scream could silence dozens. He watched how a single hanging could control an entire field of bodies. He noticed that the real power was not the whip itself, but the belief that the whip could break a person. Slowly, he understood that fear could shackle even the free. Moses absorbed this knowledge like a sponge. He studied how terror spread, how rumors traveled faster than truth, how one whispered story could shape an entire night's sleep. The land taught him that sometimes the most frightening thing was not what people saw, but what they imagined might be lurking just out of sight. Even the white elite of Louisiana, the masters who believed they owned the world, felt the atmosphere of dread that clung to the swamps. At night, they barred doors, locked windows, and ordered lamps to stay burning until dawn. They feared the swamp because it was the one place they could not control. They feared the dark because it reminded them that despite their wealth and power, they were still mortal. Moses understood their fear long before he understood his own power. He learned that those who seem the strongest often hide the deepest terror, for they build their kingdoms on bones and blood and know that someday justice may return to collect what is owed. Louisiana was a land created to break the human spirit, yet it became the forge that shaped Moses into a man capable of walking through fear rather than being ruled by it. While others bowed under the weight of oppression, Moses crawled beneath it unseen. While others dreamed of escape but saw only walls, Moses saw paths winding through swamps like veins leading to an open body. The horror of the land seeped into him, but instead of poisoning him, it transformed him. The plantation's cruelty became the blueprint for his vengeance, and the swamp became the skeleton key that unlocked his future. In this world of terror and brutality, Moses Walker was not just a survivor. He was becoming something else entirely, molded by shadows, hardened by silence, waiting for the moment the land that had tried to break him would instead tremble beneath his feet. Moses Walker's transformation did not happen overnight. It was a slow ignition, like embers glowing beneath ash, waiting for the right breath of wind to become a blaze. His life of silence and invisibility had carved him into a man who understood shadows better than he understood speech. Every day he watched as chains clinked, as overseers barked orders, as friends disappeared and returned bruised or did not return at all. This was not just cruelty, it was a ritual, a cycle of suffering that the masters believed kept the structure of their world intact. But where others saw a wall too high to climb, Moses saw cracks in the foundation. The men who ruled with steel and blood believed they could control every life beneath them, but Moses saw their mistakes. They underestimated the power of someone they never bothered to teach fear. Moses had grown accustomed to drifting, a ghost among the living. But one night changed the rhythm of his existence. He was near the edge of the fields, sitting beneath a cotton bale where he often hid to avoid notice. The moon lit the land faintly, casting long shadows that twisted with the breeze. He heard footsteps, hurried and desperate, and before he could move, a young enslaved boy stumbled beside him, falling hard into the dirt. His wrists were raw, torn from rope, and his breath came in panicked gasps. He looked at Moses, terror filling his eyes as if expecting to be betrayed. But Moses did not move, did not speak. The boy whispered that he had run, that he could not take another lash. He said overseers were hunting him like a dog. Moses knew better than to answer, but something tightened in his chest when he saw the child, small, shaking, hiding in the same shadows Moses used as his sanctuary. Minutes passed like hours until they both heard dogs barking in the distance, the sound like jagged metal scraping against bone. Lanterns flickered in the fields, voices shouted commands. Moses stood, and without a word, motioned the boy into the direction of the swamp. Few dared enter that maze of mud and spirits, but Moses knew it like a map etched beneath his skin. They crawled through brush, moved through water so cold it burned, crossed logs slick as ice. Moses did not know why he was helping. Perhaps he did not want to see someone else break the way so many had. They reached a hollow between two roots where the boy could hide. Moses left him there and returned to the fields before dawn. No one ever found the child. Some said he drowned. Some said he was eaten by gators. But the children whispered that Moses had led him to freedom. That night planted a seed in him. For the first time he saw that being unwanted, being unclaimed, meant he could choose. No overseer could forbid him, no master could punish him. He was free in a way no one else was. Freedom, once tasted even in the mind, burns like fire, and Moses began to feed it. He started by memorizing where keys were placed on hooks, where horses were tied, where the fence posts were weakest. For months, he stored every detail. It was not anger that drove him. Anger is loud, reckless, consuming. Moses was fueled by something quieter, something colder, a methodical hunger for balance. He did not believe revenge was justice. He believed justice was a storm that must be built in silence before it is unleashed. As his understanding of power grew, so did the stories whispered about him. Children said his eyes glowed at night. Women said he could walk through walls. Men said he was beyond death. When he walked past groups, they would step aside, not from hatred, but instinctive fear. Fear is something Moses never asked for, but he realized he could use it. He watched overseers wake at night to check their doors twice. He noticed masters carry pistols even on their own porches. Their fear was a weakness, and Moses learned that fear can become a weapon more efficient than chains or steel. He began interfering quietly, invisibly. When a slave was beaten for not picking enough cotton, Moses loosened the horse saddle strap of the overseer who delivered the punishment. The man fell and shattered his leg the next morning, unable to stand for months. When a woman was dragged into a barn for reasons too cruel to speak aloud, Moses stole the lantern oil from the master's supply, forcing him to walk the property at night in darkness, afraid of shadows that seemed to move. Slowly, people began whispering that the land itself was turning against the white men, that spirits of the dead were rising. They never suspected it was the silent man they refused to see. What began as accidents soon became deliberate choices. When Moses realized the overseers relied on dogs to track escapees, he spent weeks studying how they responded to scents. He learned what herbs grew along the swamp banks that made dogs sneeze or lose trails. He crushed leaves between his fingers, rubbed them onto tree trunks and fence posts, tested them in the dark until he knew which ones made hounds whine and retreat. The swamp was not just a hiding place. It became his teacher, his ally. In its dark waters he found not fear, but clarity. He understood that the world outside the swamp was a cage, and within it, the ones who claimed power were afraid of what they could not see. His transformation was not merely physical or emotional, it was strategic. Moses was sculpting himself into something the South had never seen, a force born from silence, shaped by cruelty, sharpened by observation. He did not speak, not because he lacked words, but because silence was his cloak. He let others create myths around him, myths that made him larger than flesh and bone. He did not push against those myths. He fueled them. He walked the fields only when he chose. He entered barns unseen. He knew the value of timing, of patience, of striking not out of impulse, but calculation. Each action taught him that the power taken from him at birth could be stolen back slowly, piece by piece, through shadows and strategy. While the rest of the enslaved world was trapped by chains forged from fear, Moses began forging himself into a legend that fear itself could not contain. The unwanted boy was evolving, becoming not merely a man, but a symbol. And symbols cannot be chained, cannot be buried, cannot be sold. The story of Moses Walker cannot be separated from the rich, haunting, and often violent context of 1857 Louisiana. This was a place where the air itself seemed heavy with fear and expectation, where the swamp mists curled over the fields like living spirits, and where the echoes of pain and cruelty reverberated long after the sun had set. The very land seemed alive, observing and shaping those who walked upon it. It was a world meticulously designed to maintain control. Plantations with their rows of cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco were more than economic engines. They were instruments of terror, maintaining a system in which human lives were measured in labor output, obedience, and the absence of rebellion. In such a world, the presence of someone like Moses Walker, a man considered too ugly and grotesque to sell, was both an anomaly and a threat waiting to awaken. The men and women who oppressed others relied on fear to hold power, but what they did not realize was that the same environment that bound others could also train one mind to navigate, manipulate, and ultimately transcend it. The swamps, the forests, and the shadows became his allies, teaching him lessons that no whip, no overseer, and no plantation master could impart. Every night he spent walking in the darkness, observing the habits of the oppressors, studying the weaknesses in their routines, and noting the vulnerabilities of the humans who believed themselves invincible, sharpened him into a force that could not be ignored. Moses learned the rhythms of the land with a precision that bordered on supernatural. He noticed when patrols shifted direction, which paths were never watched, and which areas the overseers believed were too dangerous to traverse. He observed the nocturnal patterns of animals, from the rustling of snakes in the brush to the way alligators glided silently beneath murky waters, and used them as markers and guides for his own movements. The swamp itself became an extension of his body, a labyrinthine companion in which he could disappear at will. While the enslaved population often feared the dark, the wild, and the unknown, Moses embraced it. Each rustle of leaves and each distant sound of water became data. Each shadow carried information. He developed a sixth sense for danger and opportunity alike, learning to move not just with stealth, but with intention. This knowledge gave him an advantage that few could anticipate, and even fewer could counter. The power of observation extended beyond the natural world to the behaviors and superstitions of the people around him. In a society dominated by both rigid hierarchy and deep-seated fear, myths and stories were powerful tools. Slaves told tales of wandering spirits and vengeful ghosts, and Moses learned to cultivate the illusion that he was not entirely human. He allowed whispers of supernatural abilities to flourish, knowing that fear was amplified when combined with imagination. Masters, overseers, and even fellow slaves began to treat him differently, not necessarily with respect, but with cautious attention. A glance in his direction could make hardened men shiver, and a movement in the shadows could make them doubt their senses. The man they once considered worthless and ugly now wielded an influence no one could touch directly. It was the perfect camouflage. The world expected nothing from him, and in that expectation, he found power. Moses also became an expert in the psychology of control. He understood that fear and ignorance were more powerful than brute force. When he acted, he did so with deliberation and strategy. The first time he intervened to save someone from punishment, he did it quietly, leaving behind only the evidence of intervention: a loosened rope, a blocked path, a sabotaged implement, and disappeared before anyone could trace it back to him. Those who were saved whispered rumors about a shadowy figure moving unseen, a spectral protector who punished cruelty and rewarded survival. The stories spread quickly among the enslaved population and even reached the ears of the masters. No one could place a name, no one could anticipate his next movement, and yet the fear and uncertainty he created were undeniable. His mastery of strategy extended to manipulating both humans and the environment to his advantage. When dogs were used to track runaways, Moses employed swamp herbs and natural scents to confuse their sense of smell. He learned the weaknesses of gates, fences, and locks, exploiting flaws that others overlooked. Every obstacle presented an opportunity for learning, every failure a lesson. While others labored under the illusion of confinement, Moses explored the limits of freedom within the very system designed to deny it. In essence, the plantations, the swamps, and the towns of Louisiana became a classroom, and he was both student and teacher. He internalized lessons about movement, timing, and human behavior in ways that would later make him unpredictable and untouchable. As his skills grew, so did the mythology surrounding him. The line between man and legend blurred. Stories circulated of his uncanny ability to appear and disappear at will, to strike at injustice and vanish before retaliation could occur. He became both protector and avenger, a figure who existed in the liminal spaces between reality and imagination. Fear became his ally, invisibility his shield, and the knowledge he accumulated his weapon. Every day, every observation, every silent hour spent in the swamp contributed to a transformation that was not only physical or mental but symbolic. Moses Walker, once rejected as worthless, was evolving into a figure capable of challenging the very foundations of the society that had sought to ignore him. And in the process, he began reshaping the perception of power, control, and freedom in a land built on oppression. Moses Walker's journey from an unwanted, rejected slave to the most wanted man in Louisiana was not simply a matter of survival, it was a transformation that challenged the very social order of his time. The people who had once dismissed him as too ugly, too malformed, too strange to be of any use were now forced to recognize that the boy they ignored had become something beyond their understanding. Every slight, every whispered insult, every moment of cruelty that had been directed at him was absorbed and stored, reshaped into a silent power that grew with each passing day. He understood that the world dealt harsh lessons to the weak, but he had learned early that weakness was not always physical. Weakness was often psychological. The inability to adapt, to observe, to plan, to strike when the moment demanded it. And Moses had all these faculties sharpened to a fine point, honed in the very shadows that others feared. He moved through the swamps and plantations like a shadow given form, unseen and untraceable. The masters, confident in their authority, assumed that anyone who had survived the lash and the auction without complaint was broken and obedient. They could not see that Moses had turned the tools of their oppression into instruments of his own strategy. Chains had taught him patience, whips had taught him observation, cruelty had taught him calculation. He did not lash out recklessly, he struck with precision, choosing the moments when a single action could reverberate across the hierarchy of power. In subtle ways, he undermined the plantation system, freeing those who had been punished, sabotaging the implements of oppression, and leaving behind evidence of intervention that could not be traced to a single human hand. The mystique that grew around him was deliberate. He understood that humans fear what they cannot see, what they cannot predict, and he became the embodiment of that fear. Word of his actions spread through both the enslaved and the free populations. Among slaves, he became a symbol of hope and quiet rebellion, a figure whose presence alone suggested that freedom was possible, even in the darkest corners of Louisiana. They spoke of him in whispers at night, passing along tales of a man who could move through the swamp as easily as the wind moves through trees, who appeared when cruelty reached its peak and vanished before vengeance could strike back. To the masters and overseers, however, Moses became a source of terror. The men who believed themselves untouchable began locking doors earlier, patrolling fields more aggressively, and questioning their own judgment at night. They offered bounties for his capture, dead or alive, but no one could find him, for he had learned to be everywhere and nowhere, blending with the darkness, moving with the patterns of the land and the rhythms of fear itself. Moses' understanding of human psychology was as formidable as his knowledge of the swamp. He could read men like open books, discerning pride, guilt, greed, and fear in their expressions, their tones, even their silences. Overseers who prided themselves on intimidation became unwittingly compliant, stepping aside when he approached and second-guessing their own commands in his presence. He understood that power was often more about perception than action, that a legend could achieve what a blade could not. By cultivating the aura of invincibility and the supernatural, he amplified his influence exponentially. His body, once a source of derision, now contributed to his mythos. His scarred face and clouded eye were marks of otherworldliness, features that made observers hesitate, speculate, and fear. The very deformities that had marked him as worthless now became tools of psychological warfare, shaping how both friend and foe reacted to his presence. As his notoriety grew, Moses began to operate on a broader scale. No longer were his interventions limited to immediate survival. He began to act strategically, planning rescues and strikes that would destabilize the oppressive structure without exposing himself. He knew that every act of defiance carried risk, and so he carefully selected his targets and timed his actions for maximum impact. Plantation owners found themselves second-guessing their security, questioning the loyalty of their own men, and fearful of the shadows that might hide him. Entire networks of enslaved people began to trust in the invisible guidance of a man they could not see, following subtle cues and instructions left in ways only they could understand. Moses had become a node of resistance, a catalyst for rebellion that did not rely on brute force, but on intelligence, patience, and fear management. The supernatural aura surrounding him continued to grow, fueled by both his strategic use of the environment and the fertile imaginations of those who saw him only as rumor. People claimed he could disappear into mist, walk through water without leaving a trace, and appear where least expected. Some even said that spirits guided his path, that he had made a pact with the dead who once suffered under the same oppression. Whether true or fabricated, these stories made him untouchable in ways that ordinary men could never understand. Every rumor reinforced his legend. Every whispered tale strengthened the psychological hold he had over both enslaved and oppressors alike. Moses Walker had become more than a man. He had become a force, an idea, a living nightmare to those who sought to control him, and a glimmer of hope to those who longed for freedom. Through all of this, Moses never sought recognition, never asked for praise. His power was in silence, in invisibility, in being the unseen hand that altered events without leaving his name behind. Each intervention, each act of liberation, each subtle disruption of the oppressive hierarchy was calculated, deliberate, and executed with precision. The world that had deemed him too ugly to sell, too strange to matter, had inadvertently forged its own undoing. In the rejection, in the isolation, in the cruel dismissal of his worth, Moses found freedom, strategy, and strength. He had learned that being unwanted could be a shield, that invisibility could be a weapon, and that fear, when wielded correctly, could protect as effectively as any chain, any whip, or any gun.